July 14, 1518. A woman steps out of her half-timbered home onto the narrow cobblestone street in Strasbourg. Without warning, without music, without celebration, she begins to dance. Her husband rushes to her side, begging her to stop. She can't, or won't. She dances through the afternoon, through the evening, all night. When dawn breaks, she's still moving, her feet now swollen and bleeding. By the end of the week, 30 people have joined her, their bodies jerking and spinning uncontrollably. Within a month, 400 citizens are dancing in the streets. And then, people start dying. Heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion. Some accounts claim 15 people were dropping dead every single day, their bodies giving out while their legs kept moving. The authorities panic. Doctors diagnose hot blood and prescribe more dancing. The city builds stages, hires musicians, brings in professional dancers to help. The epidemic gets worse. This isn't a legend. This isn't folklore. Multiple eyewitness accounts, physician notes, city council records, and cathedral sermons all document the same impossible truth. In 1518, the people of Strasbourg danced themselves to death. The question that's haunted historians for 5 centuries is simple and terrifying. Why? To understand what happened in Strasbourg, you need to understand what Strasbourg was living through. This wasn't a city experiencing normal medieval hardship. This was a population on the edge of psychological collapse. 3 years of famine had ravaged the region leading up to 1518. Crops failed repeatedly, people starved, malnutrition weakened bodies and minds. Floods and extreme temperatures had devastated the area. Bubonic plague, yes, the Black Death, was still killing people. Smallpox swept through communities. Syphilis, a relatively new disease in Europe, was spreading fear and disfigurement. But physical suffering was only part of the nightmare. The psychological terror ran deeper. A comet appeared in 1492, which people interpreted as a heavenly portent of doom. This was an era when people believed God communicated through celestial signs, and that comet screamed apocalypse. Religious tension was exploding. Martin Luther had just challenged Catholic doctrine in 1517, 1 year before the dancing plague. The entire spiritual foundation people relied on was fracturing. Peasant uprisings were erupting across the region as starving people rebelled against the ruling class. Civil unrest, religious upheaval, disease, starvation, death everywhere. And then, in mid-July, during an extraordinarily hot summer, Frau Troffea started dancing. The details of what happened next read like horror fiction, except they're documented fact. Frau Troffea was seized by spasmodic, convulsive movement and continued dancing uncontrollably all day until she collapsed. Witnesses saw her husband pleading with her to stop. She collapsed, rested briefly, then started again. The next day, she danced on swollen, bloody feet. Imagine watching your wife, your mother, your neighbor dance until her feet bled, unable or unwilling to stop. Her face contorted not in joy, but in something that looked like agony or ecstasy or both. Within a week, over 30 people had joined her. Within a month, the number exploded to around 400 dancers. These weren't people celebrating. Contemporary accounts describe the dancing as frenzied, uncontrolled, desperate. People danced past the point of injury. They danced through exhaustion. They danced when they could barely stand. And some of them died dancing. Here's where the story takes a turn that reveals just how little people understood what was happening. The city authorities called in physicians. These were educated men, the best medical minds of their era, trained in ancient theories passed down from Hippocrates and Galen. They examined the dancers and reached a diagnosis: hot blood. According to 16th century medical theory, the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these fell out of balance, illness resulted. The physicians believed the dancers had developed overheated blood, creating a feverish imbalance that manifested as compulsive movement. Their prescribed cure was both logical within their framework and catastrophically wrong. More dancing would release the excessive heat. The city authorities arranged for guild halls for the dancers to gather in, hired musicians to accompany the dancing, and brought in professional dancers to help the afflicted. Think about that decision. The authorities saw people literally dancing to death and decided the solution was to facilitate more dancing. They built stages. They hired bands. They created infrastructure for a catastrophe, believing they were providing medical treatment. This only exacerbated the contagion. The music, the attention, the official validation, it all fed the epidemic. More people joined. The dancing intensified. The death toll climbed. How many people actually died? That's one of the most contested aspects of the story. Some sources claim that for a period the plague killed around 15 people per day, which over the course of the outbreak would put the death toll into the hundreds. But here's the problem. The sources of the city of Strasbourg at the time of the events did not mention the number of deaths, or even if there were fatalities. The most detailed modern research comes from medical historian John Waller, whose work has become the foundation for understanding the dancing plague. The sources cited by Waller that mentioned deaths were all from later accounts of the events. So we have a historical puzzle. Contemporary documents confirm the dancing happened, but don't specify how many died, while later accounts claim significant deaths, but were written decades or centuries after the fact. What we know for certain is that the dancing was real, prolonged, and destructive. Whether hundreds died or merely dozens, people suffered strokes, heart attacks, and collapsed from exhaustion while in the grip of something they couldn't control. By September 1518, the authorities had changed strategies. The city council transported the dancers to the shrine of Saint Vitus for divine healing. And they were apparently cured. The dancing stopped. The streets returned to normal. And Strasbourg was left to process what just happened. 6 contemporary chronicle accounts documented the event. Artists created engravings. Decades later, Dutch master Peter Bruegel II painted Dancing Mania in his 1592 work. The dancing plague of Strasbourg became legendary even in its own time. But legend is not explanation, and for 5 centuries, people have asked, what actually happened? The first theory that gained traction in the 20th century was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. It contains psychoactive compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning, called ergotism or St. Anthony's fire, causes convulsions, hallucinations, and irrational behavior. Could contaminated bread have caused the dancing plague? Most modern historians reject this theory. Here's why. Ergot is known to produce convulsions, but ergot poisoning typically causes painful muscle spasms and contractions. It doesn't produce rhythmic, sustained movement. The symptoms don't match. Ergotism would be more likely to cause people to writhe in pain than to dance for days. Additionally, if ergot were the culprit, you'd expect the entire population exposed to contaminated grain to show symptoms. But only a fraction of Strasbourg's residents danced. Some historians have suggested religious explanations. Perhaps the dancers were members of heretical sects, performing ecstatic religious rituals. Or maybe they believed they were under divine curse and danced to appease angry saints. There's some merit to the religious angle, but it doesn't fully explain the compulsive, involuntary nature of the dancing or why it spread so rapidly. The theory that has gained the most acceptance among modern scholars is mass psychogenic illness, also called mass hysteria. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and deeply unsettling, because mass psychogenic illness isn't some medieval superstition. It happens today, right now, in our modern world. Mass psychogenic illness is a form of disorder where outbreaks take place under circumstances of extreme stress and generally take form based on local fears. It occurs when groups of people develop physical symptoms without any organic cause, triggered by psychological factors that spread through social mechanisms. Think about what that means. The symptoms are real, the suffering is real, the physical collapse is real, but there's no virus, no bacteria, no toxin causing it. The trigger is psychological, but the manifestation is physical. Medical historian John Waller built a compelling case for why Strasbourg in 1518 created the perfect conditions for mass psychogenic illness. He cited a series of famines and the presence of such diseases as smallpox and syphilis as the overwhelming stressors affecting residents of Strasbourg. But stress alone doesn't cause dancing plagues. The critical missing piece is belief. There was a local belief that those who failed to propitiate Saint Vitus, patron saint of epileptics and of dancers, would be cursed by being forced to dance. Saint Vitus's dance was a known condition. People in 16th century Strasbourg grew up hearing about it, fearing it, believing in it. When Frau Troffea began dancing, she wasn't just experiencing random movement. She was manifesting a culturally specific fear, giving physical form to the terror and stress that had been building in the community for years. And here's where it gets truly chilling. Once the dancing started, it became contagious not through disease, but through observation and belief. Modern neuroscience has identified mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we watch others perform that action. They're part of how we learn, how we empathize, how we unconsciously mimic the people around us. In high-stress environments, this mirroring can intensify. Imagine you're a resident of Strasbourg in July 1518. You've survived 3 years of famine. You've watched neighbors die of plague. You've heard sermons warning of divine punishment. You're psychologically exhausted, physically weakened, spiritually terrified. And then you see Frau Troffea dancing, unable to stop. You remember the stories of Saint Vitus's curse. You watch more people join her. The city authorities validate it by building stages and hiring musicians. Your fear grows. And then, almost without realizing it, your body starts moving. Not because you want to dance, not because you choose to dance, but because in that moment, in that psychological and social context, dancing becomes the way your mind and body express a trauma too overwhelming to process any other way. This isn't speculation. Mass psychogenic illness continues to occur. In 2022, in the Mexican city of Tapachula, a middle school girl fainted. By the end of the day, a dozen classmates had fainted. More complained of headaches and nausea. No toxin was found, no disease was identified. The trigger was psychological, spreading through observation and shared anxiety. In 1962, in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a laughing epidemic broke out at a girls' boarding school. Students couldn't stop laughing. The school closed. The epidemic spread to neighboring villages. Thousands were affected over several months. It wasn't joy. It was stress manifesting as uncontrollable laughter. These are modern examples in societies with scientific medicine and psychological understanding. Now, imagine the same mechanisms at work in 1518. In a population with no concept of psychology, no vocabulary for mass psychogenic illness, only a cultural belief in divine curses and demonic possession. The dancing plague lasted approximately 2 months. In early September, the mania began to abate. The decision to take dancers to St. Vitus's shrine may have broken the psychological spell. Once removed from the environment where the behavior started, once given a spiritual explanation that made sense within their worldview,
The dancers could stop. The belief that they had been cured became the cure. But what makes this story important isn't just the historical curiosity. It's what the dancing plague reveals about human beings and the societies we create. We like to believe we're rational creatures, that our bodies are separate from our minds, that we have complete control over our actions. The dancing plague reminds us how wrong that assumption is. Under extreme stress, in environments of shared belief and collective fear, people can lose agency over their own bodies, not because they're weak or primitive or superstitious, but because they're human. The conditions that created the dancing plague, prolonged hardship, social upheaval, loss of meaning, collective trauma, those conditions still exist. They exist in different forms, but the psychological mechanisms remain the same. We see it in viral trends that sweep through populations. We see it in collective panics. We see it in how fear and belief can manifest physically in ways that defy medical explanation. The people of Strasbourg weren't cursed by St. Vitus, they weren't poisoned by ergot, they weren't performing religious rituals. They were a population pushed beyond the breaking point, expressing unbearable stress through the only cultural language available to them. The dancing was real. The suffering was real. The deaths were real. But the cause wasn't supernatural or chemical. It was human. Frau Troffea's name survives in historical records, but we know almost nothing else about her. We don't know if she recovered. We don't know if she understood what happened. We don't know if stepping onto that street on July 14, 1518, and beginning to dance was the last normal moment of her life, or if she eventually found peace. What we do know is that her body, responding to stresses we can barely imagine, began moving in a way she couldn't control. And in that movement, hundreds of others saw their own fear reflected back at them. They saw a physical manifestation of the terror they had been living with for years. And their bodies responded. The dancing plague ended in September 1518. But the questions it raised about human psychology, social contagion, the relationship between mind and body, belief and physical reality, those questions remain as relevant and unsettling today as they were 5 centuries ago. Strasbourg moved on. The city recovered. Life continued. But somewhere in the collective memory of that community remained the summer when the streets filled with dancers, when the music played day and night, when people moved until their bodies gave out, when death arrived to the rhythm of feet on cobblestones.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one for more stories.